The Great White Heist. Hello again, racist baby. What are you doing here? Well, now that Jesus is about to come to get all the black people, I just wanted to tell you I appreciate all the time you took to explain racism to me. Wait, who told you Jesus is coming back? And why would he only come back for black people? Well, I've heard my dad talking and he was pretty upset. He said Democrats are talking about black revelations. We discussed the book of the Bible in racist Sunday school, but I didn't know there was a separate Bible for black people. No, racist baby. Those people aren't talking about Revelation, the last book of the New Testament. They're talking about black reparations. What's reparations? Well, reparations is the making of amends for a wrong one has done by paying money to or otherwise helping those who have been wronged. In this case, we are talking about reparations for slavery, Jim Crow, and the cumulative after effects. My father told me that he's tired of hearing about slavery because it happened a long time ago and he had nothing to do with it. Plus, it was legal. How can you ask for the redecoration for something that wasn't a crime? It's reparations, RB, and your father is right. But just because enslaving and stealing labor from black people was perfectly legal prior to 1868, America should not get to ignore the calls for issuing dividends to the descendants of the people who supplied this nation with 246 years of unpaid labor. However, there is a more compelling argument that may be more irrefutable, namely that slavery was just one small part of a loan that black people invested into America for which we never reaped the dividends or the principal. At the center of this argument is how this country became and remained an economic superpower, due in large part to the contributions of black America's sweat equity and actual funds. But a lot of white people didn't own slaves, so how is this their fault? Again, that's true. 75% of white families didn't own slaves and 1% owned 40 or more. But all those people still participated in the institution of slavery and benefited from the theft of labor, from the shipbuilders to the textile industry, the international traders to the national defense. This free labor propped up the entire national economy. But that was only a drop in the bucket when it comes to estimating what America owes black people in reparations. If the 14th Amendment was meant to function as a reset button to offer the American dream to the millions of black hostages whose involuntary sweat equity built this country into a superpower, then the time since July 9th, 1868 can only be described as a period of illegal theft. According to the Brookings Institution, in 2016, the typical white family's net wealth was $171,000, while the net wealth of a typical black family was $17,150. The reason for this staggering wealth disparity is not just due to slavery and Jim Crow or even America's unique form of racism. Since the moment the 14th Amendment was ratified, America has been engaged in a Robin Hood-like heist. But instead of taking from the rich and giving to the poor, the United States has circumvented the 14th Amendment by stealing black America's wealth and giving it to white people. Every white person in America, rich or poor, liberal or conservative, Democrat or Republican, has benefited from stolen goods that were hijacked from black America. Wait, are you saying all the white people back then were thieves? My mom would never steal. Yes, all white people. Look, to illustrate what I'm saying, let me tell you a story about where I'm from. In 1948, when only 16 states in America had outlawed segregated public schools, black students in the tiny hamlet of Summerton, South Carolina, where 3 out of every 4 residents were black, finally got tired of being robbed by white people. Every day, these young Summertonians maneuvered through one obstacle course after another, only to be rewarded with an inferior education. If the children were lucky, they walked as far as 9 miles to attend one of the segregated schools in Clarendon County's District 22. On other days, rain would force students as young as 6 years old to wade across the stream to attend school. Often, when the water was particularly high, someone would provide a raft to row their way across the Lake Marion Reservoir. When they arrived at school, they would have to collect wood for their unheated classrooms, if they arrived. Sometimes, a student would just drown on the way. This may sound like a rough life for impoverished rural students, but Summerton was not a poor town. The vast majority of Summerton's black citizens were employed. Many owned businesses or worked at well-paying jobs in local factories. Their employers withheld federal, state, and local taxes from their paychecks, just like their white counterparts. Summerton's black residents were not exempt from paying property taxes, sales taxes, or any other assessment their government deemed necessary. Naturally, black parents were outraged when they discovered the white children didn't have to make the same daily trek as their children because the district had purchased 30 buses to chauffeur them to school. Incensed, a group of parents begged school board chairman Roderick W. Elliott for just one bus to serve the county's black students. He said no. So Harry and Eliza Briggs, along with 19 other black families, contacted the NAACP and eventually filed Briggs versus Elliott, the first of 5 cases that would later be combined and become known as Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. But even before their case dismantled the Supreme Court's separate but equal precedent, the parents of District 22 fully understood why their children lived this precariously treacherous existence. White people in the district were stealing their money. The white Somertonians who rode on school buses bought in part with the taxes paid by black residents whose children crossed a river of racism are a perfect example of this theft. Those white children arrived at school well-rested and ready to learn, while their black counterparts endured inequities laid out in the initial Briggs versus Elliott complaint, including unhealthy and inadequate facilities, an insufficient number of teachers and classroom space, and inadequate resources. The black parents were disproportionately paying for white students' beautiful new schools and the comfort in which they engage in learning. And this phenomenon wasn't unique to Somerton. Even though South Carolina was 40% black in 1948, statewide black schools were valued at $12.9 million while white schools were worth $68.4 million. If those white students succeeded in their resource-filled schools, they could go on to one of the more than a dozen public institutions of higher learning in South Carolina. However, if the black graduates wanted to attend a state college, because of state segregation laws, there was only one choice: South Carolina State College, the only 4-year public black college in the state. This detail wouldn't matter as much except for 3 important facts about the taxpayers whose money actually funded South Carolina's whites-only state post-secondary schools and the one publicly funded black college. Post-emancipation, South Carolina taxpayers paid for 7 whites-only colleges. South Carolina taxpayers paid for 0 black colleges. South Carolina State College was a land-grant college, which meant it was founded with federal money after the Civil War, and the majority of South Carolina taxpayers were black. According to U.S. Census workers, most of the school-age population, taxpayers, and wage earners in the Palmetto State were black. Every black person in South Carolina was being robbed, and every white person in South Carolina benefited from it. Okay, I kinda see your point, but my dad didn't even go to college. He can't even help me with my homework. I'm sorry about that, RB, but the theft of black wealth wasn't just limited to education. 4 years before Somerton's black parents filed suit against their children's school district, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. Commonly known as the GI Bill, the law offered government-guaranteed home loans and paid tuition costs for World War II veterans, unless you were black. In the book, When Affirmative Action Was White, Ira Katznelson notes that of the 67,000 mortgages approved under the GI Bill in New York and northern New Jersey suburbs, fewer than 100 of the home-buying veterans were not white. A banker in Corpus Christi, Texas, reportedly explicitly told one black veteran, "It is almost impossible for a colored man to get a loan." When it came to college loans, even colleges in the North rejected black veterans, and because historically black colleges and universities were packed to the gills with students who couldn't attend white schools in the South, in 1946, only 20% of the former black soldiers who applied for education benefits had enrolled in college, according to Hillary Herbold in Never a Level Playing Field, Blacks and the GI Bill. Though Congress granted all soldiers the same benefits theoretically, writes Herbold, the segregationist principles of almost every institution of higher learning effectively disbarred a huge proportion of black veterans from earning a college degree. And many of the GI Bill's home loan denials were based on a government policy that may be the most important contributor to the racial wealth gap: redlining. Wait, even when my dad tries to help me with my math homework, my teacher marks a lot of the answers with the red line. Are you saying my teacher is racist? No, that is a different kind of redlining, my future fascist. You're talking about dumblining. For most of America's history, metropolitan neighborhoods were organically configured primarily by economics. Rich people lived in rich neighborhoods, and poor people lived in places that smelled a little bit like garlic. Even Irish, Jewish, and Italian enclaves, while ethnically homogeneous, were characterized by residents of similar socioeconomic standing. Poor Irish lived alongside poor Irish. Middle-class Italians lived with other middle-class Italians. Not only did these groups have the chance to advance economically, but they were also afforded the opportunity to achieve whiteness. And with that assimilation came integration. In the mid-1930s, the federal government sponsored the New Deal, which created huge economic programs to lift America out of the Great Depression. The government mechanized farms, funded businesses, built suburbs, gave out jobs to any able-bodied American, and created a national minimum wage. The new Social Security Administration, the SSA, gave people financial security in their old age. The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, gave people jobs. Most important, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, refinanced mortgages at low interest rates to prevent foreclosures. New Deal legislation was a massive investment in America's future, and although it was costly, it helped reduce poverty and charted a path out of the Great Depression. More than any other group of legislation in American history, the jobs, social programs, and guaranteed loans created by the New Deal are responsible for building what we now call the middle class. There was only one problem. Black people were overwhelmingly excluded from the most impactful parts of the New Deal. To ensure that these guaranteed mortgages were not risky, the HOLC created color-coded residential security maps of 239 cities. The maps essentially highlighted the neighborhoods that were good investments versus neighborhoods that were poor investments. The risky neighborhoods were highlighted in red, including every one of the 239 cities' black neighborhoods. In fact, even upscale black neighborhoods like La Villa and Sugar Hill in Jacksonville, Florida, visited by Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, and Zora Neale Hurston, were deemed too risky by the HOLC. And instead of solely using these maps for government-backed home loans, which would have been racist in and of itself, banks began using these maps for all home purchases and refinancing. Because of this, as generations of Americans lifted themselves out of poverty, black people could not take part in America's primary driver of wealth, homeownership. Redlining was outlawed in 1968 by the Fair Housing Act, but it still affects almost every economic aspect of black communities to this day. Nearly every calculable effect of institutional inequality can be traced back to this 85-year-old government policy. Redlining explains why researchers at the Brookings Institution found that homes in neighborhoods where the population is majority black are valued, on average, $48,000 less than homes in white neighborhoods. The result is a $156 billion cumulative loss in black-owned property values, even when the white neighborhoods have the same amenities, crime rates, and resources as the black neighborhoods. About 36% of education funding comes from local property taxes, the single largest source of local revenue for schools in the United States. These lower home values, which are the direct result of redlining, mean that schools in black neighborhoods receive less funding. Therefore, redlining is why EdBuild reports that majority white school districts receive $2,226 more per student than non-white districts. That's a theft of $23 billion. Residents who live in formerly redlined areas pay higher interest rates and are denied mortgages more often than whites with the same credit and income, according to reporting by the Center for Investigative Journalism. They also pay higher auto insurance rates, pay more for fresh food, have less access to medical care, pay higher interest rates on loans, receive more parking violations, pay higher bail amounts, and wait longer to vote. The white people who built their fortunes from low interest loans, cheap food, and high home values don't pay more taxes. Yet they are benefiting from current and past policies that have taken money from black taxpayers and handed it over to whites. Doesn't that sound like theft to you? At the very least, it's receiving stolen goods. But if Jim Crow ended, why should white people pay for regulations? Why is it so hard for you to say reparations? Also, no one has suggested that white people pay. They think America should pay, which includes my tax dollars as well as your dad's. But let's say your point was valid. Aside from being a racist, what does your father do for a living? I don't know. I think he's a real estate agent because he's always talking about keeping the black man in his place. Okay, my little baby bigot. It doesn't really matter. Let's say that your father discovered that the people he worked for had been underpaying him his entire career. Let's say he worked thousands of hours for which he wasn't paid. Should his employer pay him back? Of course they should. But what if your father died and you discovered that he had been underpaid? Should your father's employer pay you what they owed your father? Yes, that could have been my college tuition, my inheritance, or my junior Klansman dues. I want my money. But what if you discovered it and then you died? Should those people pay your children what was owed? Yep, they should. I might have passed down more money to them if I had my father's money. Plus, my junior Klansman dues are late. Okay, last question. What if you discovered that your father was never paid for countless hours of work because there was a rule that said employers had to pay everyone who worked except for your father? What if, because of this law, the company made millions and became a global superpower? Years later, if someone challenged that company and determined that the anti-father payment rule was wrong, should the company repay the people who worked essentially for free, even if the people currently at the company are not responsible for what the company did in the past? The company is still benefiting from the labor of my father. I say they owe me something. Well, America is that company. From 1619 until today, white people have benefited from institutional national theft. Well, when you put it like that, I guess you have a point. But has anyone ever received refutations from what you're talking about? Yes. As recently as 1988, the United States paid $20,000 to each survivor of Japanese American internment camps during World War II. The Tuskegee experiment participants and their descendants were paid a total of $10 million in reparations by the U.S. government, and the state of North Carolina paid $10 million to the victims of forced sterilizations. Florida paid $2.1 million to the victims' descendants and the survivors of a 1923 massacre in Rosewood. The United States has also supported German payments to victims of the Holocaust, and the treaties that ended World War I and World War II included reparations. And when Haiti took its independence from the French, the United States sent warships to ensure that slave owners received reparations. And most recently, in 2021, the United States agreed to pay reparations to some of the families of people who suffered trauma while being detained in immigration detention centers. Also, the word is reparations, RB. Come on, kid. But how can America just cut every black person a check? Who's going to pay for it? After all, the government's money is basically our money, right? Well, remember that Great Depression I was just talking about? We somehow found $4 trillion to pay for World War II, the most expensive war in U.S. history, just a few years later. We conjure up around $750 billion every year for a military budget that's over twice as big as China's. When COVID-19 hit the United States, we found $1 trillion lying under the country's couch cushions. Americans can somehow find billions to fund Medicare, Social Security, and Kardashian-related reality shows, but we never seem to have enough to repay the debt that America owes to black people. So, who would receive these renovations? Come on, little tongue-tied tyrant, you know it's reparations. And who receives reparations is still up for debate. The logical conclusion is that the American descendants of slavery, ADOs, should receive the bulk of reparations, which has sparked the hashtag ADOS movement and hashtag. Others disagree, saying that all black people in America are subject to the effects of slavery, Jim Crow, and anti-black discrimination. White supremacy doesn't distinguish between someone whose great-great-grandmother was stolen and a third-generation Nigerian immigrant. Plus, if we tied reparations to the lineage, white people might get the bulk of the funds. Mathematically, most descendants of the enslaved are living as white people, even though they have at least one person of African descent in their family tree. And remember how good they are at finding loopholes? There is also an argument for generational-based reparations, namely, any fourth-generation African American whose parents lived in the country before the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1965 would be compensated with an increasing amount distributed for each generation of their family that resided in America. Of course, there are also problems with that plan. Could the descendant of a person who immigrated to Nova Scotia in the 1850s petition for payment? How about the Maroons who absconded from plantations as soon as they arrived in America and were never enslaved? What about someone who can't trace their lineage because their ancestor escaped slavery and changed their family name? Should we include Haitians who come to the Louisiana Territory as free people of color? They were never enslaved, but their descendants were subject to the same inequality, terrorism, and subjugation as the small minority of Africans who were manumitted in their first generation of being enslaved. I guess it comes down to what reparations mean. Are they a back payment for the free labor for which slaves were never compensated? Or are reparations a compensation for slavery, housing discrimination, Jim Crow, unequal schools, lynchings, redlining, and the cumulative effects of 400 years of codified anti-black white supremacy? My dad says black people already get all his tax money in government handouts and welfare. Why should he pay instead of giving his money to me? If your dad really cared about you, he'd want you to live in a world with less economic inequality, better schools, and fewer poor people. The value of the property he passed on to you would increase if there were fewer poor neighborhoods in your town. Studies show that crime is linked to poverty and economic inequality, so you'd be able to live in a safer world if we repaid the debt that caused much of those disparities. He wouldn't have to worry about black people taking his tax dollars if he repaid the debt that caused those problems. And remember when your dad said he was tired of hearing black people whine about slavery and racism? Imagine how tired black people must be. But my mom says America will never give black people reparations. Do you think she's wrong? We have to remember one thing. Your mom is a racist. Ida B. Wells spent her entire life fighting for a lynching law, and it never happened. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality." Has that happened yet? Although many people in the black community have dropped it like it's hot, few Americans have referred to Juvenile as Big Daddy while simultaneously backing that ass up. My point is, you can't stop trying to do something just because you don't think it will happen. Justice demands restitution, and until there are reparations, there can be no justice. Until there are reparations, anyone who pledges their allegiance to the flag that stands for a country with liberty and justice for all is a liar and a thief. Okay, I get it. Well, I have to go now. I told my dad I was going to find out about black revelations, not reparations. Okay, my little mini Nazi, you might want to make sure your dad doesn't read the original book of Revelation. Why not? Because when he finds out that Jesus is black, he's probably going to be pretty upset. Unit review. 3 little questions. 1. What is the most valid argument for reparations? A. It would decrease the racial wealth gap and wealth inequality. B. Reparations are an economic stimulus for the economically depressed. C. Black people are still paying for something that happened before they were born. Or D. America already has a huge deficit. Why not increase it even more? Number 2. What is the most valid argument against reparations? A. Reparations would decrease the racial wealth gap and wealth inequality. B. Reparations are an economic stimulus for the economically depressed. C. White people shouldn't have to pay for something that happened before they were born. Or D. America already has a huge deficit. Why increase it even more? And 3. What would the founders say about paying reparations? A. Allow a government to decline paying its debts and you overthrow all public morality. Alexander Hamilton. B. It is incumbent on every generation to pay its own debts as it goes. Thomas Jefferson. C. Nothing. They're dead. Or D. You freed what? Supplement. The black women who won reparations. While reparations have become a popular topic in the national conversation in the past few years, the struggle for holding America accountable for the injustices this country perpetrated against its black citizens actually began before there was even a place called the United States of America. And as usual, black women have led the way. When Betty Slew, a free white woman, gave birth to Jenny Slew in 1719, there was no question that Jenny was free. Even though Jenny's father was a black man who was more than likely a slave, Massachusetts colony laws dictated that a child's legal status was determined by the birth mother. But on January 29, 1762, John Whipple, an evil white man in Ipswich, Massachusetts, decided Jenny was a slave. He didn't buy her or argue her status. Whipple, with force and arms, took her, held, and kept her in servitude as a slave in his service and thus restrained her of her lawful liberty, and did other injuries to the amount of about $25, according to the civil suit Jenny Slew, Spinster versus John Whipple Jr., gentleman. The court dismissed Jenny's case because Whipple argued that Jenny was married, which meant she couldn't legally call herself a spinster. Under Massachusetts law, a woman had no legal identity apart from her husband. But Jenny appealed her case, informing the Salem, Massachusetts Superior Court she had been married more than once to enslaved men. And since the law didn't recognize the marriages of enslaved people, she was technically a spinster. Jenny's lawyer, Benjamin Kent, was an early abolitionist who was known for fighting in court on behalf of enslaved people. Historians know about Slew's trial because Kent's best friend was in court every day and wrote about it in his diary. This friend was a pretty big deal, some dude named John Adams. Jenny Slew won and was the first enslaved person in America to be granted her freedom in a trial by jury. Not only did she win her freedom, but the jury awarded her the cost of her previous trials and extra in damages. The judge declared, "This is a contest between liberty and property, both of great consequence, but liberty of most importance of the two." After the trial, Kent helped his bestie with the project and suggested he include a phrase that he used in Jenny's trial. When Adams finished his little project, the Massachusetts Constitution, the world's oldest still functioning constitution, he included the phrase inspired by Jenny Slew. The phrase would be revised by Benjamin Franklin and used in another one of Adams' projects, the Declaration of Independence. That's how a black woman inspired this little phrase in the part of the Massachusetts Constitution known as the Declaration of the Rights of the Inhabitants of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. All men are born free and equal, and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, in fine, that of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness. Does that sound familiar? When Adams and Kent were working on the Massachusetts Constitution, they met in the home of Colonel John Ashley of Sheffield, Massachusetts, a well-respected, Yale-educated lawyer. One day, one of the enslaved women working in Ashley's home overheard them reading the newly ratified Massachusetts Constitution, and the "all men are born free and equal" line stuck out to her. The woman, known as Mum Bet, would use the precedent set by Jenny, not from the auction block, to free every slave in the state. Born in 1742, Elizabeth Mumbet Freeman once tried to stop her cruel slave mistress, Hannah Ashley, from hitting Bet's little sister with a heated shovel. Bet blocked the blow with her arm, scarring her. For the rest of her life, she refused to cover the burn mark. When curious people asked about the scar, Bet would shrug, stare at Ashley, and say, "Ask the missus." Yes, Betty was petty. She left the house, refused to return, and eventually sued for her freedom. After she heard that she was born free and equal, Mum contacted Thomas Sedgwick, an abolitionist lawyer. According to Sedgwick's wife, Mum explained, "I heard that paper read yesterday that says all men are created equal and that every man has a right to freedom. I'm not a dumb critter. Won't the law give me my freedom?" Sedgwick was ready to put up a fight, filing a case in the Great Barrington Court of Common Pleas on behalf of Bet and Brom, an enslaved man. In May 1781, a Massachusetts jury took one day to decide that Mumbet should be emancipated, but Colonel Ashley decided to appeal. So on August 22, 1781, Massachusetts Supreme Court Chief Justice William Cushing was ready to issue his decision on Bet and Brom versus Ashley when Ashley dropped his challenge. Legal experts agree that Ashley understood that instead of his breaking a particular law, the challenge was to the existence of slavery under the state's constitution, so he had no path to victory. Bet's actions had summarily emancipated every enslaved person in Massachusetts. The court also awarded Bet 30 shillings, the equivalent of $763 today. Bet changed her name to Elizabeth, chucked the deuces to Ashley, and spent the rest of her life working for Sedgwick. For pay, of course. And maybe you're saying, those previous cases were important, but should the proceeds from lawsuits be considered reparations? Maybe they're just legally awarded damages. Well, Belinda Sutton, previously Belinda Royal, has now entered the chat. Belinda was stolen by an armed band of white men from the place we now call Ghana. Her master, Isaac Royal, sided with Britain in the championship round of the American Revolution. After the war, he fled to Nova Scotia, figuring New England's patriots might be mad at him. This was before Belichick took over the team. In 1783, 70-year-old Belinda petitioned the Massachusetts General Court for a pension for herself and her daughter, writing, 50 years her faithful hands have been compelled to ignoble servitude for the benefit of an Isaac Royal, until, as if nations must be agitated, and the world convulsed for the preservation of the freedom which the Almighty Father intended for all the human race, the present war was commenced. The face of your petitioner is now marked with the furrows of time, and her frame bending under the oppression of years, while she, by the laws of the land, is denied the employment of one morsel of that immense wealth, a part whereof hath been accumulated by her own industry, and the whole augmented by her servitude. Wherefore, casting herself at your feet, if your honors, as to a body of men, formed for the extirpation of vassalage, for the reward of virtue, and the just return of honest industry, she prays that such allowance may be made her out of the estate of Colonel Royal, as will prevent her and her more infirm daughter from misery in the greatest extreme, and scatter comfort over the short and downward path of their lives. Belinda and her daughter were awarded the equivalent of $2,500 per year. But here's the thing, the Massachusetts General Court wasn't a judicial body. It was the name of the state's legislative body. She had won her reparations by a legislative act. In 1818, Winnie sued her enslavers in the Missouri courts, but instead of arguing her slave status, Winnie charged her master, Phoebe Whitesides Pruitt, with assault and battery and unlawful imprisonment for holding her against her will. Winnie contended that since slavery wasn't allowed in the Missouri Territory or the Northwest Territory, the moment they brought 12-year-old enslaved Winnie to the Northwest Territory in 1793, she was legally free. The Whitesides lived there for 3 or 4 years before moving to the Missouri Territory, holding Winnie as a prisoner for about 20 years. Winnie was awarded damages of $167.50, or about $4,102 in 2022 dollars. Whitesides appealed, and the Missouri Supreme Court case, Winnie versus Whitesides, eventually set the standard for freedom petitions. But Winnie, Jenny, and Mumbet had nothing on Henrietta Wood, who won the largest U.S. verdict specifically for reparations. Wood was born around 1818 and sold to a New Orleans-based Frenchman when she was a teenager. When Wood's master returned to France, his wife brought Wood to Ohio and registered her as free. Wood found a job and went about her life as a free woman. But in 1853, Josephine and Robert White, the daughter and son-in-law of Wood's former master, hired a deputy sheriff to kidnap Wood and sell her back into slavery. Wood sued for her freedom but lost because she couldn't produce documents that proved she was freed. She was sold again and eventually ended up on a Texas plantation where she remained enslaved until the end of the Civil War. But Henrietta wouldn't let Josephine and Robert's re-enslavement stunt slide. In 1870, Wood filed suit against the deputy, asking for $20,000. The jury sided with her, awarding her $2,500. That's about $67,000 in 2022. Wood used the money to help pay for her son's education. He became one of the first black graduates of the Northwestern University Law School. Henrietta still wishes a mother... Nah, that's too easy.